Why are cybersecurity professionals so adamant about building their home lab and so particular about their home networks? We'll go into this today and have a look at my home environment, my lab setup, how I do it, and why I do it. Hi, I'm Sam Schneider, and if you run into me at DEF CON, my handle is Zetacork.
And hello, everybody. I am Michael Smith. I'm also known as Rebelov.
Welcome to this week's Security Sync.
So I want to start out with a question for you, Sam, which is, why do you think everybody in our industry is so obsessed with building a home lab?
Oh, well, that's a very easy. You just lofted me a softball.
It is a softball. It's fair.
Well, the home network is incredibly important. First of all, if you're a security professional, you certainly want to do due diligence. You don't want to be the focal point of an attack or a breach, and have your stuff just thrown out there in public view. Also, it gives you a safe place to practice your craft, and to apply your knowledge, your capabilities into your own space. It's easy, it's fun, and you can do some cool stuff with it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times we're driven by chaos, right? So you have this chaos engine, and you turn the crank, and sometimes a fluffy kitten spits out. Other times it's a tiger that tries to eat you. And sometimes it's something that you don't even know what it is. You're like, I don't know, it's alien. We did this with Log4j, where everybody overnight had to become an expert on Log4j. What is it? Where is it? They had to become an expert on software bill of materials, concepts that we just didn't think about before that. And now you've got usually the business or work, or, even if it's just talking to your friends, something that you've never even heard before. And now you have to figure out what it is, how to secure it, and how to actually organize a response around it. One of the ways that you can compensate for that is A, learning a lot of different things, and B, being able to do research for a specific purpose to find out what that new, vulnerability or software du jour is and what to do about it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? And you need a safe space to practice your craft. If you certainly can't go out on the public internet and do it, right? If you do that, you get in trouble. And we don't advocate that, by the way.
Yeah. And I think maybe a final thing, which is just a little bit of a riff here, which is getting access to enterprise software and being able to actually have skills in using that enterprise software, simply because it's hard to get licenses and it's hard to get experience, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
like everybody comes in and they're like, well, do you have experience with, Splunk, Palo Alto, CrowdStrike? Well, you can get demo license for a lot of things, bring it home, install it as a VM in your lab, and then you have skills that you can go out and talk about or demonstrate in an interview or a technical interview, or even a demo.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me segue a little bit here. 15 years ago, we used to work together. We worked together on a project.
Has it been that long?
Sadly, it's been more than that. This was like 2005, so we're almost at 20 years, Sam.
Yeah.
But we were interviewing people for security engineering jobs and stuff
Right.
like that. And one of the things that stuck in my head, I don't know, impacted me. Like it was so obvious, but yet I hadn't heard it to date, that I still remember it almost 20 years later. And that is, one of your common interview questions, or your standard interview questions, is, tell me about your home network in your lab. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that? Like, why is that in your, bag of tricks?
Yeah, absolutely. It comes down to self-care, right? Are you going to take care of my business? Can I trust you to do that? I want to know what you're doing in your own environment. I want to know also, something that's very important for me personally is I love to self-learn, and I use a lot of open source software. And my lab environment, my home environment is where I practice that, right? And I know that if someone's doing that, they're taking care and they can tell me the details, the technical details of their network, that they're a qualified professional. They're someone who, I might want to work with, right? Conversely, if I ask you to tell me about your home network and there are no firewalls, you don't have switches in place, you don't have VLANs in place, it's going to open up another segue into different questions, right, about your skills
Yeah.
and capability.
Yeah. And not to sound like an MBA, which nobody's ever accused me of, but somebody who has a home lab and is working on different projects, it shows a certain level of passion for the field.
That's right.
Right. And MBAs like it, hiring managers like it, but it means that it's somebody who actually likes the career field.
Well, it's kind of like today in the security field, being in like a sales SE. Any job interview that you go into, they're asking you, well, you need to do this, you need to perform this test. You need to demonstrate to us that you can set up a application and you can actually present a security discussion against how we protect this, right? They want to see you actually do something. And in my mind, that we did this way before it was cool, right?
Yeah.
We're actually looking at people's capabilities, and I wanted to hear that passion. You're right. I wanted to hear the passion about, why they love security, why they do what they do.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think we covered that pretty well. You want to move on and let's get into a network diagram. Show me what you have and what does your network look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Give me a second here and I'll share my screen. I'll bring that up. All right. Here we have an example of a network that's somewhat similar to my setup, right, that we have here. It's not an absolute. No, this is not my home network. I'm a security professional. You think I would share that with you? Not going to do that, but I will use this as an example, right? Most networks are going to be set up this way. I'll just say that as a caveat. And here we actually have the public internet sitting out here, right? We have a provider's cable modem or fiber that's coming into some type of device that's bringing in. And then this is really the demarc, right? This is where our home network is starting to become defined. We're going to have some type of firewall sitting out here, right? And I do love pfSense, by the way. I've always loved that platform. I'm getting ready to jump, though. Since they actually took the community edition and they're not doing updates as frequently for that, they want you to pay for that support. I'm actually going to be moving into a different variation of this.
Which part of that I understand, right?
I do too, right?
I get it.
I get it. You have to feed the family at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But this is what's really important. I want to impress this upon the audience. You need, I love utilizing VLANs to segregate traffic, and especially at the firewall itself. Now, this diagram is a little different, but in this case, you have a lot of devices that are wireless and so forth going into this wireless access point. We may have a switch out here instead, right, and have the access point behind it. But to have an IoT VLAN or a media VLAN, as a lot of people would call it today, you have televisions, you have Roku devices sitting out there, things that are networked.
Smart TV. Smart TV.
Alexa devices, right? Things like that.
Smart thermostats.
Yes.
Like all that stuff, yeah.
Yeah, man, that's something you definitely don't want to get popped, right? You don't want somebody going out there and popping your thermostat, your television, things like that.
Sometimes it's not even that. So I've got an ESP8266 on my desktop here.
Right.
So this guy, right? It's a little single board computer, Arduino compatible. So you program it just like an Arduino. It's got GPIO but it connects, but it connects via Wi-Fi, but it can only do 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi. So
Right.
it can only do slow Wi-Fi. And so a lot of times you'll have devices that can't do good encryption, right? For Wi-Fi. So, or you have problems doing MAC address filtering. You have problems, basically just problems because their tech stack is so archaic. You need to have some kind of a sacrificial network that they can connect to.
Right. And then, you bring up a very good point. There are multiple frequencies, like we have 2.4, we have 5, for example, right?
Mhm.
And then we have new emerging standards like Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 7 coming out,
Yeah,
or Wi-Fi
yeah.
7 specifically. A lot of
You
6
know, in
devices
China,
out
they
there.
already have Wi-Fi 10.
Oh,
No,
real.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Keep going.
Yeah, it's China, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But just to impress a point here, all of those devices, Alexa devices and so forth, they don't need access to your network, right? And if you're
yeah.
storing your files out there, your photos, your data, maybe work information if you're really, really bold, uh, we don't want anything else to have access to this network or these resources
Yeah.
on this network. So we use VLANs. VLANs are easy peasy to set up. And if you have a good quality access point, it will support multiple VLANs.
Mhm.
So, for example, I use Ruckus, right? I love Ruckus access points out there. And I have wireless VLANs for core network services, for things like IoT types of devices sitting out there. I have a guest VLAN, just like we see here, right? And then I
Mhm.
also have lab VLANs because I want to be able to move around in there. And that's the big difference here, right? Is you're not going to see a lab VLAN on this one. But also, and I know what you're going to be thinking about. You're going to be thinking about the malware lab,
Mhm.
aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we
Love it.
would certainly want to create an isolated VLAN for that. However, I would take it a step further, and you need a separate firewall sitting down here. If this were a lab, for example, we would want a separate firewall sitting out here because we do not want, under any circumstances, anything that is potentially shady that could get out of our network. We don't want that going out here. We don't want that, certainly don't want it going out here, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I have, and I think you have the same setup. I've got a virtual machine running pfSense, and that virtual machine has different LAN segments. They're all virtualized, right? They're literally virtualized on the hypervisor. But they these different LANs inside of it. I've got one that's a penetration testing environment. I've got another one that's the malware, like the malware exploding environment.
Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's important to have a mix, right?
Mhm.
You have to diversify, and like I said, self-learning is important, but you also need to protect yourself as well.
Yeah.
You don't want to go out there and let something leak out of your network and get blacklisted because of that or anything else.
Or pwn you. That's
Oh
the
my
age old
gosh.
joke is you're not really a malware analyst unless you've infected yourself accidentally. We all do it at one point or another,
Yeah,
but throwing a VM where I use Spice and Vert Manager to actually get access to the desktop environment without going across the network, right? So I get access through the hypervisor.
right.
That actually gives me someplace where I can go explode malware, run malware, and know that it's not going to spread out to the rest of my network.
Right. So speaking of virtual machines, right? There are a
Mhm.
lot of good open source products out there. For my home lab and for my home network, and they are kind of one and the same here. I use VLANs to segregate the networks on the back end, but something like Proxmox, which is an open source type of hypervisor. And they do charge for support if you wanted to do that. But you can go out here and download this environment. Currently, I'm sitting at an upgrade point, so I need to be a version 8, or I will be a version 8. We'll do that in the later podcast, right? But
Yeah.
just as an example of what I'm doing here, I have multiple virtual machines that sit out here, and I have a couple of these that are dedicated for labs that are sitting out, right? Like Reliant is dedicated for labs, and I have an LXC variation that's dedicated for labs that I can actually, put software that I want to learn about on there. I have a couple of other things sitting out here though. I have my PiHole high availability set out here as
Mhm.
well, sitting out here. So I have one on a virtual machine and one on a physical Raspberry Pi.
Mhm.
So it actually uses Gravity Sync on the back end, and it'll actually update all the rules, all of the block list, all of that stuff automatically. I only have one source to manage it from, and that's that's important, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, I run like Docker on a virtual machine. It's a
Mhm.
virtual machine within a virtual environment within a virtual machine itself, right?
Yeah.
On that, I have several network services that I run for my home network, and it's critical. It's a critical piece, and I'll go into those here in a minute. And then finally, I have a open source version of Active Directory, so LDAP server sitting out there. It does many things. It has many services. It's called Zentyal, and we'll certainly go into that. Let me give you a real quick view of what I do with the Docker side on here. Using a manager, a Docker manager called Portainer. And on Portainer, I have a number of different containers that are running here. So I run security services. I run a password manager. So if you're familiar with Bitwarden, are you familiar with that, Mike?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely.
password manager.
Yeah.
So, that's a commercial password manager, and you can pay them to run a back end on the back end. But there's also a open source or free sourced back end that you can run on a Docker container called Vaultwarden. And Vaultwarden basically back ends everything on this Bitwarden instance. So that's the password manager type of approach. And I would highly encourage you to do this. It has many advantages. I'll just show a couple of things here real quick. You can see it automatically detected the site that I'm in as I
Yeah.
brought that up, right? But I can go in here, right? And I can look at I can have different vaults for different people. And what's really cool is this is not just for me. My entire family uses this.
Yeah. Right.
So I went through and I taught them how to use that. But what's important here is a lot of people, I mean, unfortunately, some security professionals as well, they have like a couple of passwords that they use for every single site they visit. Well, what happens if that password's pwned, right? Or that
All of the credential stuffing that
exactly.
that I've been fighting for years and years and years.
Exactly.
Right.
So, what's really cool about this is I can actually go in here and I can generate different passwords with different links, different character mixes. I mean,
Mhm.
you want to really, put something up there. Let's go up to a 64-bit or 64 byte type of password or a 7-character password. Not so much, right? I mean,
Mhm.
getting in, I like to look at anything over about 30 characters as long as the application space will cover it. But every single site can have their own unique password. You never have to touch it again. It's managed by the platform itself. And that's something that we do here, right? In the Vaultwarden backend. This is one of the systems that we use. So we'll go in here, we'll look at this, autofill it, right? And now, not only can you see all of the sites that we're actually looking at here,
Mhm.
but you can see the owner, how it's associated. If you have multiple vaults, you can have multiple vaults. You can have vaults based on domains that you set out there, you define. And then, of
Mhm.
course, everything else in your tools, right? You have different tools you can set up, your password generator, the data that you're utilizing. You can export your vaults. You can look at exposed passwords, weak passwords, reused. You can literally use this to fix your password problem, right?
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
something that I would encourage. What do you think?
Cool. Yeah. I
Pretty
like
cool
it.
stuff, right?
I like it. Yeah. But what happens when you're someplace remote and you want to access it?
Yeah. So basically, I would have to go into my VPN at that point, right?
Okay.
So we're going to log into a firewall here. We're looking at a typical pfSense dashboard here, right? But in this case, we would use WireGuard. Now, I run WireGuard as a scheduled service when I know I'm going to be out. I don't leave it up all the time because I don't want to unnecessarily expose my network to the outside world, right?
Mhm.
But if we're going somewhere, and I did this several times, especially when we're in Europe. I would actually go out to DigitalOcean and buy a couple of machines and actually run WireGuard services through there in that domain. That way, I
Yeah.
was originating from my place, right, in Europe.
Mhm.
Real easy, and I could actually create a tunnel back to this system and then lock it down with firewall rule. That way, you can't just come in from any IP. You have to know specifically where you're coming in from,
Yeah.
and the site. And I can create that tunnel with that service, and have a more protected type of entry point. Once I get into my network, I bring up
Then,
Heimdall.
yeah.
Yeah. And at that point, everything that I could do locally, I can do remotely wherever I am in the world. So if I wanted to go up, for example, and look at Uptime Kuma, for example, and we'll just go through this. And you can see the names up here. I have unique names for each
Yeah.
one of my services running. We can go out here and look and see what's going on. See if I have any local services that are down. Obviously, if your internet connection's down and you can't get in via VPN, you're going to have a problem, right? You can't see any of
Yeah.
this. But that's the way with all pretty much all home networks, unless you're really you have an alternate way in, for example, like a cellular network on the back end.
Yeah.
But we can see I'm monitoring multiple services here on this, and separate sites as well. So I look at my specific site. I'm looking at IBIS Mortis. IBIS Mortis is a, a cloud resource that I've created for some of my tool usage out there. But this basically just gives me a quick view of services. One of the really cool things, Mike, we didn't talk about here is that I also get notifications via Telegram on this.
Yeah.
So I actually have an upbot on Telegram, and it'll actually tell me. So this has been very helpful a time or two when I've been out in the field, and all of a sudden I get a notification on Telegram that, hey,
You have
I
a service system.
can't reach your source domain.
Mhm.
Okay, well
Okay.
now I know what's going on, right? I need to
Yeah.
make a phone call, whatever. So that's pretty cool. Uptime Kuma is really interesting. I'm actually looking at going in a different direction from Kuma.
You're almost looking in a different
I'm
direction.
always, and that's really key, right? You need to always be
Yeah.
learning because we're always changing and adding new cool things, right?
Mhm.
On the back end. So are you familiar with PiHole?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so PiHole is one of those really cool black hole DNS services. I run this locally. So like I said, I run 2 instances, and Gravity Sync actually keeps us up to date. So we're going to primary. This is where all my modifications and changes are made. And you can see this thing is always looking for, malware, advertisers, things of that nature, domains that are blacklisted. And I have quite an extensive list in here.
Blocking 38.5%.
Yes. And that's an example. I mean, you're hitting of my
I
total.
know why. You're blocking advertising.
Yes,
That's why.
a lot of advertising, but by taking a multi-pronged approach, you can't put all your eggs in one basket, right? Not all lists are equal, right? And
Mhm.
I actually did this for a long time on pfSense with PF Blocker as well. So I did it in tandem with this service, and I also was using they used to call it Umbrella, but OpenDNS
Mhm.
services, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And OpenDNS also had categories, so I had multiple areas where I would block either malware domains, dating sites, things I didn't want
Mhm.
kids to go to, right?
Mhm.
Things like that were blocked at different levels. Well,
Yeah.
that's good and it's bad, right? what happens, and this actually happened to me back in 2020 during the pandemic. I was actually interviewing with a company, and all of a sudden, I got on the interview, and they could see my video, but they couldn't hear me.
Ah,
And I had to figure out what was going on
interesting.
very quickly. Well, what was going on was that one of the domains, um, one of my blocking domains in PF Blocker,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
had been picked up. It was previously reported as a malware domain. And unfortunately, Zoom expanded their /16 and they incorporated that network.
But that's never, yeah.
And that was where my audio was going, and boom. Now I have a
Yeah.
problem. I have to figure that out, right?
Really? Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Well, this is what's really cool. I mean, if you're not familiar with PiHole, I encourage you to go out and look at it. This allows you to actually look at or configure different resources. So I have a multi-tier DNS, and I know, Mike, this is your favorite subject in the whole world, is DNS, right?
Disclaimer there. I work for a large DNS provider.
Yes, you
Yeah. Well,
do.
amongst other things, right? So infrastructure and cybersecurity. But
Yes, yes, you do. And we can see some of the different domains that are being hit here. I mean, this has PiHole is very, very rich in reporting and all that, but this is a redundant service. And why is it redundant, you may ask? Because DNS is
it's because
important.
it's DNS.
Because it's DNS, it's important. So I've
Yeah.
actually had a failure on a Raspberry Pi running PiHole. And this is what prompted me to move in this direction. So we'll provide in the show notes, we'll actually provide a access or a link to Gravity Sync as well. There's a really, really cool, and I believe it's Techno Tim that actually does the installation of that. Maybe a little old, but it's still very cool and very prevalent. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And you had a bunch of lists.
Oh yeah.
Right. You have a ton of different lists that you block. Yeah.
Oh yes. Yeah. I
Yeah.
believe there's almost 1 million. If we look in there, there was let's look at the dashboard here real quick. And
domains and
638,000, right?
Yeah.
I think I have actually removed quite a few. At one point I had 1.4 million in there. So it was quite a few, but you know, we don't want to limit the services we provide, and DNS is how they access things on the internet, right? So it's important that you hone that list as we go.
Yeah, I was blocking ad sites. It lasted all of 2 days. My user population revolted because they like to look at ads to see what they could buy.
Well, it's really interesting, and now you have services like YouTube that if you're not watching our ads, we're going to basically stop you from doing everything else on it. And one of the things we talked about as far as open source tools, so I love Zentyal. Zentyal, if you don't want to pay the money to Microsoft to have a 2019 server or whatever is current at this point, and to have access to an authentication, LDAP authentication service in the back end, go out and download Zentyal. Zentyal provides everything, almost everything that you're going to get, and more importantly, this is a really cool thing. If you have native Microsoft tools on your Windows installations, you can actually point it to this server and utilize those native tools with this server on the back end, which is very cool.
Yeah.
So all of my Windows systems, all of my Linux systems authenticate to this LDAP server. So everything on my network, including, my NAS, I have, different brands of NAS sitting out there. By the way, this is the PDC, and one of my NASs acts as the
backup.
Yeah, it's a backup domain controller.
Yeah.
So once again, redundancy. If this fails or is down for whatever reason, users will go or know to go to that backup domain controller, and they can actually authenticate against that. Very cool stuff, right? We have an alternate. We have DNS in here as well. I only use this. I use this as a local store. Everything else is forwarded out.
Yeah.
So the very same way I use it with PiHole, for any local queries. So anywhere, anything that's houseschneider.local
Not local.
forwards here, right? So that's anything that's outside of that domain space is actually forwarded externally. And
Okay.
in this case, you can use like Cloudflare, right? You can
Mm-hmm.
use OpenDNS or others, right, Mike?
Others, I happen to work for a company that has one of those. We do have a public DNS, and we have a couple flavors of it. We've got one that's filtered, one that's not, and we have one that is filtered and you put your own policy on it.
That's cool. That's very, very cool.
So it's really, I spend a lot of time in that thing, figuring out how it works and how to configure it best. But I like it.
So we were talking about access points, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is a critical cog. That is something that you really, really need to pay attention to in your network. And this is one of the reasons why I love this particular setup. And what I'll do here is I'll go in here and we'll actually look at the different access points. I have 2 access points running here.
Mm-hmm.
And let me just.
Yes.
I know, right?
You say do not show again.
I know. I don't know why it was showing it. It's not like the first time I've been in here, right? But you can actually see where I actually have clients connecting in, if there are any
Mhm.
issues or events, if what's coming in over 2.4, what's coming in over 5, right? This is good
Mhm.
actionable data, and we won't even get into the collection of this data and actually being able to look at it with Grafana. If you noticed on my Heimdall installation here, I
Yeah.
do have Grafana on there, and I use that as kind of I use it in an elk stack configuration, so I can actually graphically report everything back in there. So I have a couple of remote sites sitting out here. I have Udemy. I have a game that I love. I love this game. If you're out there, by the way, look me up. I'm Outlaw Grog. And then, of course, sites that I use. So here's an external site, right? You know what that is, right?
Yeah.
And if I wanted to remotely access it, and like with everything, I use my password manager for everything sitting out here. I can log into this. And if I'm out and about, and I don't want to do that right now, if I'm out and about, I can add a device to it. So I have at one point used all of these different devices, right? That, as a remote tool. And if I want to go out and evaluate, let's say a buddy asked me to look at his network, I can go out there and start looking at it with a Wi-Fi Pineapple or with my Signal Owl sitting out there.
Yeah.
Very cool. So that's, just kind of a high level overview of what's going on. My lab is segregated into my Proxmox. It is physically separated from my home network stack.
Okay.
It is physically separated. So actually I have a closet sitting over there. The Proxmox server sits over there, and I run fiber between my switches. So, most network users are not going to do that. They're going to switch out. They'll be in the same closet. But my house is kind of cool and kind of unique. I actually built this house. And when I built it, I built the home run for all telephone, all power, all networking, all video, all of that runs through a single closet.
So you want to show me what you're doing for lab equipment,
Yeah.
and how does that set up?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me stop this share right here, and I'm going to drop down. So I take a multi-pronged approach, right? I have virtual machines sitting out on my lab instance of Proxmox sitting out there, which is a separate physical instance of it, because once again, we want to keep that separate, right?
Separate. Yeah.
But I also run virtual machine. So VirtualBox, I'll run VirtualBox on a local instance, and we can put things in here, and I'll bring this up here real quick. So this is the VirtualBox instance we have here, and what you're looking at is a couple of systems that I use in my testing. So we have pfSense running out here. That's in a VirtualBox instance. I have OpenSense running on my Proxmox, so that's what I use out there as well, and probably going to be migrating my large networks into that as well. But in this case, I have pfSense running on VirtualBox, and I've actually created a netted network. So
Okay.
that netted network provides some layer of protection for me. So between the LAN and the WAN interfaces on there, I can actually provide those rules. And this is how I prevent any leakage of my lab from getting out. All of these, like Metasploitable 2, obviously you don't want to expose that to the world. It could serve as an entry point into your network. Bad practice. Don't do that. I have my own sets of different, in this case, this is Ubuntu running out here. And then finally, my Kali Linux instance that I use, and I'll jump into this here real quick. Let me bring that up.
Okay.
So let me share that screen here for a second. So everybody knows Kali, right? It's like the personal favorite. It's been a fantastic operating system for a long time. Different people have different things they like to use, different tools they like to use, or distros. I've always used Kali in this. And if you can see in this instance right here, this is one of the examples of how I use my lab. So we can talk about a really cool facet of security that I've been delving a little more deeply into here lately, and that's API access, hacking, security, all that. There's a fantastic resource out there called API University, and they actually have their own certification and testing. They'll actually train you on this. Well, this is one of those labs, and I love, bash scripting, so I set up my own little checks. This actually starts an environment. Let's see if that environment's up here real quick. I'll do this. I'll open this up. Let's see if that was the right password. It is. Okay. And we can actually see that this environment is up and running. If I actually went in and tried to access it here on Firefox, I can certainly do that. We'll see if that comes up. Awesome. We'll give it a second to load here. You can edit that out. Okay, cool. And we can actually see some of the tools that I've used in the API security training, right? Going to VAPI, VAPI's pretty cool. Want to kind of mention this. Crappy and VAPI are used for testing on the API side. VAPI has a very cool capability. So you can actually go out there and look at undocumented or unknown APIs and actually walk the sites with this and build out documentation for it. So you could literally take an unknown source with VAPI and actually walk out there and create documentation for it. It's pretty cool. Mailhog's used on the back end as well. But anyway, that's an example of how I use that, right? And that's one of the facets of the lab. And of course, you have your standard complement of different tools on here as well.
Yeah.
So like the wireless attack stuff, I've heard several people here recently yapping about, well, aircraft engine is no longer a valid tool. Well, I think that's crap, right? Every
still does a
every application, right? You have a specific task that you want to do, and as it says, I mean, it was brought in with WEP, but we can still use it for WPA. We can capture that TCP handshake, right? Or that authentication, that WPA handshake.
Yep.
Right? We can definitely capture that. Right?
Yeah.
It's just like everything else.
Especially if you use it with disassociate.
Oh yes.
Right.
So yes.
you start disassociating, and then they do lots of handshakes, and then you capture all the traffic, and you can crack it. Yeah. So it's still viable. I think. Yeah, there was one of the bad things about the security industry is occasionally you have toxic people,
Oh yeah.
I think IT in general has that. I think cybersecurity has it. And in this case, it was somebody who was harassing a friend of ours who wrote a book. And they were saying, look, aircraft NG, it's archaic. I think they actually used archaic or obsolete, and it's not. It's not. It still does the job today.
Right. I mean, there are a number of tools, right? I mean, it's up to the professional that the way you approach it is your way. And this is why labs are important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you want to explore a new tool. Maybe you want to look at things. This type of setup allows you to do that. So it's, in my view, it's very important for me. I like to self-learn, and
Mm-hmm.
this works better. I don't do well, Mike, and I've never done well with going to a $5,000 vendor supplied, pay and play type of class where you
Mm-hmm.
sit in a class for 7 hours a day for
Mm-hmm.
4 days a week. I mean, that is archaic in my mind. I can't do that. So I can.
It's hard. It's hard to send people to that, right? So if I look at this as a security manager,
And
which I am,
expensive.
and I'm like, I'm going to spend how
Yeah.
much?
Yeah.
Right? Like some training now is $7,000 or $8,000 for a week.
In my view, it's
Um,
not worth it.
Plus time and expense, right? I
Yes.
still have to get somebody there, and I have to pay for flights, I have to pay for a hotel room to send somebody there. And in order to justify it to my boss, I probably have to require that they take a certification test afterwards,
Right.
right? So training is crazy expensive. So you might have some training budget, but you have to pick and choose who you spend it on. Do you want to have some kind of lock-in to make sure that they stay with the company for a little while? Like you put some kind of restriction around it just to ensure that you're spending that particular budget wisely.
Right. Just as a caveat with that, I'm the same way, right? I don't like
Mm-hmm.
to, if I'm looking at my team, one of the reasons I asked that home lab question is I want to know who is passionate about what they do. And those are the kinds of people that I know are self-starters. They're
Mm-hmm.
homeowners, and they can help the team grow because they're going to
Yeah.
bring that motivation and that drive in, and they're going to say, "Hey, have you heard about this tool? Let's work on this." I mean, one of the cool things is, and I'm going to date myself here, when I wanted to become a Novell CNE,
Mm-hmm.
um, my employer couldn't afford to send me to that school. I worked for a small school system here in
Yep.
Southwest Virginia. They couldn't afford to do that.
Huh.
What did we do? Well, we bought the books and we formulated a study group, and I had a bunch of like-minded people who came together on Saturday morning with their personal time for 3 hours every Saturday morning, and we would discuss and we would go over things and we would learn from each other. And you mentioned the toxicity in the environment. It's always
Well, the
always been
opposite is
there.
always true,
Yes,
right?
and
The opposite is
that's
always
what
true.
we look for.
That's
We need
yeah.
that. We need to come together, like, as a community. I know this is big at DEF CON, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We are a community, and we need to be there for each other. We need to help each other out, and we need to work together. You will go further, faster, and better working together with your other security professionals, working in your labs, inviting people into your space. You will
Mm-hmm.
go further, faster than you ever will by yourself.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things that I wanted to say a couple minutes ago, which was, as a security manager, before I send people to training, the first thing that I ask is, have you looked at the free or low cost training? Right? And there's lots of training online, even if it's how to an introduction to penetration testing. There are tons of different just videos, YouTube, LinkedIn Learning, which is actually really cool if you have a paid LinkedIn account. There's tons of learning there, but there are tons of free resources. But almost always, what you're doing is you're downloading a VM, or you're starting with a scratch VM, you build it in your lab, you have some kind of a script or install procedure to build that learning environment, and then you go learn whatever that skills is. So just like you did with API University, hey, it's free training, it's out there, it's available, but you have to build your lab environment first in order to go through the exercises to get that kind of knowledge.
But yeah, and also, I mean, in the vein of APISec, API University, there's also Black Hills Information Systems. They provide free training. There is, there are CTFs that are out there. There are Hak5, right? Hak5 is amazing. And they provide the back end for you in that case, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, there's also Let's Defend. You know Let's Defend?
oh yeah.
It's like Hak5, but it's for blue teamers, SOC operators, forensics folks, incident responders.
Cool.
So I like that. So I think kind of the last topic we want to go over is, what are 3 projects that you've actually used your lab to learn? And I think you've mentioned them tangentially, but let's make it more explicit.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
What have you used your lab to learn?
So a couple of things, right? So Docker was one of the things that I learned on my own, right? Installing that, in the VM space on Proxmox, and then being able to set up the other services, the Docker managers. So there's Rancher out there. There's another one that I want to use called Rancher as well. So learning that environment, learning the commands, YouTube is an awesome resource as well. So if you have an interest in this, you can do that. And what you need to just go out and do it, right? Roll up your sleeves and do it. That's one thing. Another thing is certainly any open source tool that I have an interest in, that I want to learn about. That's going to be my first place. I go out there and I install it. That's the very first thing you do. And you can typically tell a lot about a tool from the installation of that tool. So I know of a lot of, commercial, very expensive security tools. They didn't take the basic time to actually look at the install script. And, that tells me that if they don't take the time to do that, is the tool really that valuable, right? At the end of the day, what else did they not look at the end of the day? And then the last thing is bash scripts. I like to do a lot of testing with bash scripts and doing scheduling with cron and so forth. So doing that and running that in a separate VM gives me a little bit of latitude. I can do that before I put that into my home network lab and not break things, which is important.
Yeah. So do you subscribe to the philosophy of, I will replace you with the small shell script?
Not really. Because eventually that shell script's going to break, or eventually it's not going to work, or it's not going to do something, or it's going to be outdated, or a command's going to change, right?
Resource that it's trying to rely on isn't going to be there.
That gets into a whole deeper widget of replacing people. And no, people are incredibly important to this entire process. And I don't think we'll really quite get there, not for some time. And with that, we'll wrap it up here. I hope you got a lot out of the home network experience and our home lab experience and our discussion about this. I'm Sam Schneider.
And I'm Michael Smith.
Thank you so much. And if you got value out of this, please like and subscribe. Take care.
Yeah. And make comments.
Yes,
we like comments.
We love comments.
All right.
Bye.